Hey peeps, it's James Buckle of Engage Pixel, and this is part 3 of my little tutorial series on memory buffers and saving and loading game. Part 1 is, if you come at this sideways, the part 1 is linked below, or I'll put a little card in the top left, and you can click on that there and that will take you to the first part of this series. In this video, we're going to add to our code by changing the system so there's now an unlimited number of entries, and the list can be amended to by writing new data to the end. Instead of just saving the entire dataset each time we save it, we're going to add an amend script which will open the file and add the extra data after the last entry. To do this, we will record the position for the next entry when we save and load, and when we amend the file we will write to that location on the buffer. So what we'll do is we'll create a little script, call it amend file, and then close it. Now if we pop up to the create event in our object file, what I want to do at the start is just say randomize. This way it'll reset the random seed every time you run, and you'll get a bunch of different interesting names instead of just same ones every time you start the start again. Now we're going to get rid of this DSMap file data as we're not using that anymore. Then we're going to go to the bottom here and create some new variables. We need to record the entry position, we'll initialize it to 0. We need to record the next entry index and initialize that to 0. We also need to create a variable called db entry to hold the current entry that we're using, and we'll initialize that to 0. What we then need to do is call the load file function, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in an if. I'm going to say if load file. Now the reason I've done that is because in a moment I'm gonna, or when we modify the load file script later, we're going to change it so that it returns a boolean, and this boolean will tell us whether or not the file was successfully loaded. If you recall, at the start of the script it says if file exists and then attempts to load it. If it doesn't exist, it's going to return false. So we will only execute the next set of the next bit of script if the file was successfully loaded. So what we're going to do is we're going to say db entry equals database access is 0. So whatever was loaded, there has to be at least one entry, which will be entry 0, and we're going to grab that. Next, what I'm going to do is create a new script, because what we need is this little bit here which initializes all this data. We need to use those 4 lines here. Now you could just copy and paste them in here like this, but there's likely going to be other instances where we're going to need to initialize this, whatever data set we just grabbed, we need to initialize these variables with. So what we'll do instead is we're going to create a new script. We're going to call it setup display. It's going to update the display variables. As usual, I cannot spell that. We paste them in here, and we're going to change everywhere it says person. You're going to make that argument 0. And that's it. We then go back over here and we go set up display, and in here we put db entry. Now you could just put this database index by the accessor at index 0. You could put that directly in there in this instance, But it's also useful to actually have logged which entry you're currently using, regardless. I've also initialized that variable up here because if the load failed, then we still want this variable to exist wherever we use it later. Now we can also go to the step event and replace all of these with setup display person. So now our little bit of script here is a lot cleaner and simpler, and if we want to know what setup display person does, we can just middle mouse click on it and be like, oh, there it is, it just initializes all that data. That's great. So now we need to change the draw event, because I also want to know what entry we're currently on. So that's this entry position variable. We want to have that displayed. So if you copy the top line and paste it in above, and then do a y minus 14, so now it'll display the entry position above the name, and we're then going to change this to open quotes entry colon space close quotes plus string open close brackets, and inside the string puts entry position. So now we're also displaying the entry position of the current set of data. So now we're going to change the we need to change the step event. So instead of it's now we want to use the cursor keys, the left and right cursor keys, to actually move back and forth through all the different sets of data. So actually, if we get rid of all of that and change this to VK left, and inside this we'll say entry position minus minus, so we're going to decrement the entry position. We're then going to check to make sure the entry position hasn't gone below 0 by saying if entry position is less than 0, entry position equals 0. So now that caps entry position and prevents you from decrementing it down to a negative number that won't have a corresponding database entry. We then grab that database entry by saying database, and using the accessor we supply entry position as the index. So that will grab the data map corresponding to entry position and put it in DB entry. Now we need to check that it has actually grabbed some data and that it hasn't grabbed a load of junk. So we're going to say if not is undefined. So what we're saying here is DB entry undefined? Essentially this function just says is it undefined, but we don't want to know if it's undefined, we want to know if it is defined. So I've put the not at the beginning to say is it the opposite of what this function which is that it's defined. And if it is, then we're going to call setup display and supply DB entry as the data. So that'll update to the selected data. Now I'm going to copy that. We're going to change it to VK right. VK right will increment entry position with ++. We will then check if entry position is greater than or equal to DS list size database. So we want to check the size of the database and make sure that the entry position isn't equal to or greater than the size of the database. If it is, we make entry position equal ds list size database minus 1. So this effectively caps entry position at whatever the maximum number of entries are. It can't exceed size plus 1. We then do the same, or we leave all this the same because we're just grabbing the corresponding entry and updating the display to it. So that's all we need to do. That's all we need to do for the step. Now we need to update key press space so that instead of, as it does at the moment, creating 4 people, we just need to create 1 and then call the amend. So what we're going to do is get rid of this loop. We're going to get rid of where it says clear database because we aren't going to clear the database anymore. We're going to change where it says var person to db entry. We're going to replace all these underscore persons with db entry. We're then going to, before we actually add it to the list, we're going to update entry position to be ds list size database, because this effectively gives us, see, the way, if you have a database, let's say there's a database with 8 entries in it, those entries will be numbered 0 to 7, but the ds list size will return 8 because there are 8 entries, but they're numbered from 0 to 7 because everything starts from 0. Now once the new entry is added to the list here, there will then be 9 entries which will be 0 to 8, and the latest entry which we just added will be entry number 8. So by grabbing ds list size before I actually add it to the list, that's basically getting whatever the number of the last index, it's getting what its index number is going to be, because at this point there's 8 entries 0 to 7 and we're about to add index 8, which is the same number as the size. After we've done that, we go set up display. You can see how this function is really helpful now, don't you? Because we're not there typing the same long lines, 4 lines of code out every time. And we supply it db entry. We then call the amend file function that we're about to create. Now because this setup display helper function is so helpful, I'm going to create a new helper function, because we're actually now writing data in more than one place. Because we're writing data when we go save file, but we're also writing data when we go amend file. If I middle mouse on amend file, boom, we want to write data in here as well. And we want to write the same data in the same way. So it would be easier if we had a single write data function which basically did all this bit in here. So we're going to create a script and I'm going to call it write data. And then we'll go up to here. Slightly lost where all my stuff is. Go up there. We'll drag it into here and put it in the middle. So now what we're going to do is we're going to save, and we're going to go write data packet to buffer. We're going to create, we can have 2 arguments that we supply. The first will be the buffer that we're writing to, so it'll be var buffer equals argument 0. The second is going to be the actual packet of data we're writing, so var db entry equals argument 1. Now you might be wondering, why am I doing this with arguments at all? basically it's going to be a lot easier if you do everything within a single script, and everything can be changed within that script, instead of that script being connected to a whole bunch of other stuff via non-local variables. So within these scripts, it's best to give as many local variables as possible and as few non-locals. So I'm localizing through arguments the buffer we're going to use. Next, we need the actual write data. And all we need to do is come over here, grab these 8 lines here, cut them out, come over here, paste them in, hang about. I have 2 lots of save and what's going on there, so let's just drag you over here and close those. Okay, not sure what's going on there, but so I've gone to save the save file, I've grabbed those out of there, and I'm going to replace them with the write data, and that's supply it with the write buffer and person. So now if we go to write data, we need to update the code we copied across to say buffer and db entry. So now when we go save, it loops through the entire database, grabbing each entry, passing each entry along with its buffer to the write data function. The write data function will then write that data to the buffer. Now we can create the amend file and also use this write data function instead of having to type all of this out again. So we go to amend file. Add entry to end of file. So the first thing we need to do is actually create the create the var file variable, as we have done previously, which is file.buff. There we go. We also need to create a variable to hold the amend buffer, but we're not going to put the buffer in just yet because I first need to check if the file actually exists. So you go if file exists file, else something else. Now I'm going to go on a slight tangent a moment and talk about this file exists function, because there's a number of these something exists functions in Gamemaker, like data structure exists, instance exists. You always got to be a bit careful about using them. See, in the case of things like the data structure exists, the instance exists, if you've written your code well, if you've done it properly, you should really know whether or not that stuff exists or not. You shouldn't be using one of these things. These are basically safety checks, and generally if you're having to use one, it's because somewhere in your code something's gone wrong and you've lost something or lost track of something, and you're better off going back and fixing code to make sure you know where everything is than relying on these does it exist functions. Generally speaking, if you're using one, you've screwed up somewhere, and you've got to make sure you haven't screwed up before you go and use them. Now in the case of if file exists, you have to use it because the file exists outside of your code. It's a something between running last time it's saved and when it's loaded up, someone could go and delete that file, and now you're trying to load it and it no longer exists because someone independently deleted it. So you have to use file exists here, but the other ones, just sort of be careful and think twice about whether or not you use it. Like if you're using data structure exists to check if a data structure exists, then ask yourself, Why don't I know if this exists or not? Because you should be able to walk through your code and know what exists at what point. So you shouldn't have to check if a data structure exists. You should already know whether or not it exists or not. So yeah, there's my little tangent on using these exists functions. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say, okay, if it exists, we can load it. So amend buffer equals buffer load file. So because it exists, we use buffer load to load it into the amend buffer variable. If it doesn't exist, then we're creating a new file. So we say amend buffer equals buffer create. Let's make this one a K this time. Buffer grow with an alignment of 1. So what we're saying here is we're checking if this file exists. If it does, we load it. If it doesn't, we create an empty buffer to work with. Either way, when we get to here, we have a buffer and we just need to add the entry into the end of that buffer. Now we do that by saying we need to position the buffers, the right position of the buffer. We need to set it to whatever position is at the end of the last entry by saying buffer seek. Wait a minute. Buffer seek amend buffer seek start, and then say next entry index. So what I've done here is the buffer seek function that moves. You use this to move the read or write position of the buffer. So the next time you do a buffer read or a buffer write, that's the position it's going to read or write from. So you need to give it the buffer to move the position for, which is the amend buffer we're working with. You need to give it a base position to start from. Buffer seek start is the beginning. There's also like buffer seek end if you want to go at the end, that sort of thing. And next entry index, this is the number of bytes along it's going to be from the beginning. So we've done our seek. Now what we need to do is actually write the data, which we will use this write data function that we created, and we will go amend buffer. It's not how you spell amend. Amend buffer, and the entry which is the current DB entry. So that writes whatever the current entry is, because that would have been created over here. In keypress we created a new map in DB entry and we populated it, and then we called amend file. So we're adding that in there. Now having written it, we need to update next entry index. We need to update this because having just written a bunch of data in data write, we need whatever the position that the current read write position is for this buffer, that's the position that the next entry will need to be written to. So we need to record it, and we can get whatever buffer it is, whatever the position of in the buffer is, we can get that with the buffer tell function. And we supply that with the buffer. So now we know what position the buffer finished write when the buffer in write data, when it finished writing each of these pieces of data to the buffer, we now know what position it finished at by using buffer tell to grab it, which means next time we get to do some writing, we can specify that's where you need to write to. Having done that, we need to save the buffer. To file, and then we need to buffer delete, There we go. No, that says buffer decompress. Let's try that again. Buffer delete. There we go. So that's all we need to do to amend the file. Now we need to go back and change our save file. I'm going to make that say data, just because I've got rid of everywhere else that says people and I want to make it neat and tidy. But otherwise, that will still function in the same way that it did before. It doesn't actually need to change how this code works. Let's check on the load file. We're going to need to change a few things here because, well, first of all, it's going to be loading more than 4. It could be potentially unlimited number, so we need to figure out how many things to load and load them all, and etc. We also need to handle telling it because you recall when I did the create event, we changed it to if load file. So now we need to return a boolean. So what we're going to do is we're going to go var load OK equals true, so you put that at the top, and then down here where it did done goof file can't be found, we do load OK equals false, and then at the end we return load OK. So now this load file is going to tell this bit at the start whether or not it loaded OK. But we also need to fix looping 4 times. So we're going to keep the clearing the database and creating a read buffer. We'll need to log what the current entry is going to be with a local variable called entry, initialized to 0. We're also going to replace this for with a while, but we need a way of controlling this while. So I'm going to go var has entries equals true, and then in here we're going to has entries. So now the while loop is going to just keep on looping as long as you have, well, until within the loop it checks to see if it has any entries and flicks the flag to say nope, don't have any entries anymore, and stops. So within this while loop, the first thing we want to do is grab the current position of that, the current read-write position within the buffer, and log that as the entry position. So we're going to buffer tell read buffer. So grab the current entry, the current read-write position within the buffer. So this is going to keep looping through this while loop, and each time it's going to keep reading and it's going to update with entry, which is going to record the beginning, which is going to record the position at the start of the write of the load. Because if it attempts to load something that's not there, we can say, oh, there's nothing here, so this entry, this is the entry where we need to next write to. I'm going to change this to say data, just because, and I will update all of those to say data as well, just because. Now what I'm going to do is these little pairs of buffer read and ds map adds, I'm going to split this pair here, and within this I'm going to check what time has read, and I'm going to say if time equals 0, has entries equals false. I'm doing that because time will read in a number, but if it gets to the point where there's no number to read in, then it's going to say, well, it's going to read in a 0, so it's going to say this byte, there's no data here, because it's going to read in an empty buffer, and if you read an empty section of buffer with a U32, it's going to return 0, and then we can stop doing this loop. So we will say has entries is false, that will stop the while loop, but we also need to make next entry index equal entry. We then say else, and we will close this if else off after the list add. So you can then indent those a little bit. So if time doesn't equal 0, then then we can then add all of this data to the data map and add the data map to the database. We can then delete the buffer, and it's all fine and good. And that should be last of load, so we should be okay. And if I run it, so it's loaded in the current set of data. We can move back and forth to it. If I press space, we now have entry 4, Charlie Johnson, age 44, born December. If I press it again, we have entry 5, Jane Bell, age 50, born in February. If I then do a restart, it will have loaded all this data again, and we'll see it's all there. It's had Charlie Cartwright, Sarah Burton, Jane Smith. We have 2 Jane Smiths. And if we reload, there we go. So now you know how to amend data to the end of a file. In the next video, I'll show you how to overwrite an entry that's in the middle of the list. And that video should be on the top right. If you just go clicky click, I'll see you in a second.